Yeah, let's.
Okay, it is being recorded.
Okay, so I'll start slides. Can you see them? And I don't.
Yeah,
We can see it.
Okay. Yeah. So, well, my page looks weird. Yeah. All right. So this is actually the page when you go to Google and you type CHASC Astrostatistics, you get to our web pages, which is amazing because I didn't know that we will come up. But you have to type astrostatistics with CHASC, and you can see that we have several sub pages where you can learn about the talks and see our tutorials and software, etc. So this is the link to our web page, and the name at the CHASC, as we said, was founded in 1997. So it has been 23 years since we started this collaboration. And if you go on website, you can see the people involved over the years, the students and postdocs and everybody who was here in the past.
Oh, speaking of which, David, I tried to update it, the list today, but I think you have the most recent versions of where everyone is. So, of the students, yeah, all the previous students and everything.
Could be. We updated it for something recently. Maybe that grant. I can have a look.
Okay.
Yeah, and there is, if somebody wants to have some students have an idea of how to make our web pages more modern, then they're welcome to help us, because this page is as old as our collaboration. And
No. I updated the CSS in 2020, in 2010.
Yeah, students have a lot of time. So if somebody feels like they don't know what to do, they can play and maybe update our interface to the websites. But okay, I'll talk about general concepts of high energy astrophysics and refer to the data, and I will show a lot of nice images. Not too many equations. So for statisticians, you typically see a lot of mathematical description of models and events, etc. Here, I will really focus on images and on the data, so things which we actually detect before going into statistical descriptions later on. So high energy astrophysics concerns the observations which are performed in X-rays and gamma rays. So on the left part of this graph, you have the two missions, Fermi, which is the gamma ray mission, and Chandra, which is the X-ray mission. And then everybody knows Hubble and Spitzer, which are the lower energies. So Hubble observes in optical and Spitzer observes in infrared. The high energy astrophysics data are not detectable from Earth. So you really have to go out to space to detect X-rays or gamma rays. Some gamma rays, very, very high gamma rays or TeVs, can be detected on Earth, and there are different methods to detect those. So today I will really focus on the observations performed by Chandra and the issues which were related to Chandra, the data issues.
One quick comment, if I may. Not about this. I just want to tell the new people that they should speak up. We rely on this being a discussion. I mean, they're never actually just, a series of slides that people just walk through. Right. So feel free to jump in whenever you have a question or a comment or anything.
Yeah. If there are questions, please ask.
Sorry.
So, okay. So sources of high energy radiation, so the X-rays and gamma rays. So the X-rays are, of course, on Earth, you go to the X-ray machine and the X-rays go through you and you through your body, and you get the image of your hand or your leg. What actually we do with X-rays, we observe the photons which come from different sources of this high energy radiation. So it comes from, stars, supernova remnants, clusters of galaxies, quasars, all the compact objects. Basically, every astrophysical object emits hard or high energy radiation. The processes which lead to this emission are very different depending on the type of the source we're looking at. So the main goal of the observations is to learn about the physics underlying this sources, this emission. And also one point to make is that the high energy radiation typically points to the very energetic processes, because you have to heat up the mediums, plasma, to very high temperatures, millions of degrees, in order to generate thermal radiation of that plasma. Or you need to accelerate these particles like electrons, protons, to very high velocities, relativistic velocities, so they are able to emit via non-thermal processes like synchrotron emission or a comptonization process. So different types of physical processes are ongoing, but high energy radiation tells us about these events. To get a supernova, you have to explode the star, right? So looking at the remnants from that explosion tells us something about the physics which led to this explosion, to this exploding star. So this is the data example of, if you look at the image, you see that the source is pulsing. This is a Crab nebula. And what you're looking at is the Chandra image, which is taken at a few epochs. And you can see that the structures evolved and the shapes changed. So the main idea about the data here is that our data are Poisson in nature, so we count the counts. So each little dot in this image represents the photon count. And you can see that the structures evolve. So we have the spectral, temporal, and spatial variations when we observed this type of sources. This is one of the examples. I thought that I will just give this big sort of sketch of the overview of the scientific experiments when we actually design scientific experiment, what we do. So we have data collection. So we design observation to observe a source, and we think about the possible physical processes which we want to study. So we collect the data. Then the data is collected by detectors, and there is some data preparation which is being done by standard pipelines, and then instrument-specific processing software. So when we get to the point where we try to do data analysis, we're already looking at the data which has been pre-processed in some ways. So the statistics typically comes into the place where we analyze the data. We're looking at the source detection, looking at the source's properties, image analysis. So what are the structures in the images? Do we see these features? What are the energy distributions, energy spectra in the source? And we apply models to understand the source physical properties. And also, in order to get conclusions and final decisions about our experiment, we use statistics. So in this final step, we always think about statistical properties. And then we either say we already know what's going on, and that's our final result, or we need more data, so we design a new experiment and we repeat that kind of loop.
Aneta, can Can I ask a question about, because this group has been, since we're all statisticians, we have focused mostly on the data analysis, the interpret results, so on and so forth. We really had, as far as I know, we have not been that involved in the kind of a data preparation, data pre-processing
Right.
step. I just want to get the sense. Now I'm thinking broadly this whole concept of data science, which include all the data processing, everything. Is that the part you do mostly within yourself, or you collaborate with the computer scientists, and how long these processes are? Because we know how complicated data analysis is, but I imagine this data you call data preparation or data pre-processing, that's a complex
Yes, it is
right?
because when you get the data from the satellite on the ground, you have the telemetry information, and that's you need to know the format in which this information comes to the ground. So you have engineering data related to the spacecraft, all the information about pointing of the sky, which you have to process. So there is in Chandra you've got the optical camera which tells you where the X-ray telescope is pointing. So you collect this information. Basically, all this information comes as a telemetry. We call it telemetry, and sort of base level, which requires the knowledge of the engineers who designed the satellite and the entire data collection at the satellite, to understand that first how to decode this information, and then from the engineering point to sort of level 1, so level 0 and level 1 data. This is the also very involved process in terms of really getting the aspect, so the optical camera, and getting the information about every single photon which landed on the detector. And you get all this, the rates of the photons. I mean, there is a lot of information. So it would take, a different talk probably to describe that, but it's a very involved process, and we don't, I mean, you assign some uncertainties at the end to your, let's say, location where the pointing of the satellite is. So Chandra pointing has certain uncertainty. So when you decode the time during the observations and the pointing of the satellite during observation, there is a certain uncertainty which is associated with that. And that uncertainty is then folded into our final sort of aspect reconstruction, how well we can determine the location of the source, for example. So this is, I mean, these are the, I mean, it's very complicated now when I think about it, but
it is
written, written in late 90s, early 2000s, in order to actually get all this information on the ground. So it's, there is a statistical analysis which are going on, because there is the, engineering data tells you about the thermal properties of the spacecraft. And when you're looking at Chandra, the part of this Chandra mirrors, which are 10 meters long, could be, one part could be hot, the other part could be cold, and you have a thermal changes. So there is a lot of engineering data which is related to, let's say, temperature of the satellite. And there is a team of engineers who is analyzing this data. So there are different, statistical problems which they're looking at. And I'm sure there are some questions where, we could maybe have a talk from the engineers team. Somebody could give a talk on the problems they have, because there are.
I have 2 comments.
Yeah.
So one is, we have been encroaching a little bit in the upward direction here through our calibration uncertainty analysis. So, all this engineering data and of course, going from the voltages that come out of the instrument to photons and everything, is a calibration problem. So everything from the second bullet here, the data preparation through data analysis is essentially a calibration issue. So we have actually gone up almost to the top point. And which brings me to the second point, which is that I think there is room for significant statistical analysis in the define your experiment part.
Right.
For example, people want to devise observing programs for to do specific types of analysis, and right now it's pretty much scattershot. That is, it would be nice to
expand on.
Right.
Expand on
well, I mean, the reason I raised this question is it's not like we don't have enough to do, but everything we do in a way can be fundamentally affected by how the pre-processing was done, right? And so I certainly encourage us to go nicely, as Vinay called it, go upwards, right? Get deep into the woods. But I remember, Vinay and Aneta, you probably remember years ago we had this Radcliffe workshop with Alicia, right? Alicia Goodman. We kind of talked a little bit about the kinds of problems. I think who was there? Was Doug Feinberg there? Finberg there? Was he there? Was talking about
Doug Finkbeiner?
Finkbeiner, right? I remember was the issue was there was this discussing about, there was decision made early on, like what data to save, what data to process, that really got people later got very agitated because they kind of destroyed these are raw data that the others want to look at, right? There are others say, well, don't touch my raw data, But on the other hand, there is issues how much you can store all these issues. So I think we should really get it. I think it's a great idea to invite some of these talks, and because this is the area we get. It's also good for our students because these are really moving to more what we consider data science now, because it's more about the database management, all the things, it's also go outside of our comfort zone, but that's how we learn. We probably should get also involved, getting these engineers to give us.
So we can find somebody to give a presentation. I know that there are statistical questions which they have, predictions for the, temperature prediction of the satellite, for example, and the avoidance, because we're getting into the eclipse season where the satellite goes very close to the Earth, and the thermal conditions will be very different, and we don't want the detectors to be hot. So there are questions which they're working on, and it will be nice to maybe address them here. So
well, let's try to arrange at least one talk this semester, if possible, on the topic. That's going to be great for all of us.
Yeah, I'd like to chime in a bit on that. I mean, as I think, Aneta, you've raised an enormously important point about spacecraft operations. And they do generate models of spacecraft behavior and the characteristics of the systems, which, as was pointed out, depend upon this massive data set that they've had over 20 years. They have to figure out what are the trends. So there's an awful lot of, I don't know if you want to call it semi-empirical modeling going on. So I think they would be a really fascinating thing to bring them in.
I think it will be interesting. Yes. Okay. So we'll figure out a few talks, because I know at least about two problems and two cases. So maybe we'll do that. Okay. So all right, going back to students. So this is sort of a cartoon of the observation and data collection. So on the left we have astrophysical process, and this is the artist view. So we have some accretion disk, black hole, and the jets, and then this source emits a random number of photons, which travel through the universe, and then they hit our detector, and then we collect the data, and this lower green image shows the actual observational data which comes from the source we imagine is there. So given this green data points, we have to draw conclusion about the physics of the source we observed. And of course, this image, the drawing is artist's view of the material around the black hole. And the only image of the material around the black hole that we've got recently was this EHT image of the radiation around black hole in M87. I don't have the image here, but that's the first image we've got so far. The artist's view is our imagination, and of course the physics which we all are trying to learn. So this is the sketch of Chandra mirrors and how this left side shows the Chandra and the focal plane and the field of view of the telescope, and the X-rays are emitted on the right side from some object, and they go through in the interstellar medium, so that cloud, and some of them are lost because of that travel through the universe, but then they hit this parabolic mirrors, parabolic and hyperbolic mirrors, and then they land on our focal plane where our detectors are. So this is where the measurement process and data collection process happens. And Diab talked about the mirrors of Chandra, which collect these photons together. So they travel and then they focus on the focal plane. So in the
Chandra mirrors, by the way, are the best X-ray mirrors ever made, and are likely to stay that way for at least another decade.
Yes, this is the best angular resolution one can have in X-rays right now. So Chandra mirrors. So data collection continues. So we basically record each arriving photon, so the location of the photon on the sky and the energy of that photon and the arrival time. Now, when I was thinking about this engineering data, every single photon has some uncertainty measurement associated with location of the sky, energy, and even arrival time, because there is the time resolution of the detectors, which limits the continuity of the time. So all variables are discrete, and we have high resolution, which means we have very fine discretization of the images. So when we generate the image, it will have the number of pixels on which we locate the photons. And the data is stored as tables of photon counts, and each tables of these events which collected all the photons the event files which collect all the photons, we can make all the spectra, images, and light curves. So using spectral analysis, spatial analysis, and timing. So on the top, I show the energy spectrum. This is the X-ray spectrum, where basically you have number of counts in every energy bin listed, and it has special shape. Lower image shows the Chandra image of the cluster of galaxies, and it's very rich with all the structures. This is a raw image. There is no smoothing in it, but you've got structures which are not easily described but in computer ways, right? Detectable structures. By eye, you can see these structures very, very well, and you can draw something there. But if you have a lot of images and you want the computer to identify all the features in the image, that's not very trivial. And then,
is it just me, or I'm seeing something? The image shows a clear face of a goat.
Yes, that's Perseus cluster, and there is a ghost. Yes, it looks like a ghost image.
Wow, this is kind of scary.
Yeah, So it was actually this image, I think on one of the Halloweens, this image was used by Chandra Press to talk about the ghost. And they made it in the orange colors, I think, too, at the same time. But yeah.
This can add lots of conspiracy theory, but I'm not going to go there.
Well, I was showing Crab Nebula in the first image where it was moving, and this for me is always a very funny structure to be generated. I mean, appeared in the sky. That's another one. Then the timing, so light curves are plotted on this graph in the center, where we have the number of counts per time bin. So there are these different types of data products which we're looking at. So there are some challenges for the data. So I listed here several of those that our data are sparse, and in some cases they are locally saturating. So we have pileup cases, and all the data, also photons are independent. So we have Poisson data we're dealing with. There are instrumental effects, which I will show later on. There is a question of how to detect sources in deep images, which may have more background in them, but still relatively sparse. There are irregular extended structures. The source boundaries, which in low counts regime are quite difficult to describe. And our models, which we apply to sources, are very complex and nonlinear. And also we have this periodic, non-periodic stochastic variability. And here is the light curve from Fermi gamma ray telescope, which shows the flaring events across the time. And image is from the Chandra. That's a low counts image. It's not as rich as the ghost image in the previous one. This is just the galaxy, and you can see that there are like some point sources and some smooth structures in it, but it's very sparse. You have a lot of places in that image which don't have any counts. So I said I will say something about the instrumental effects, and we dealt with those in our calibration papers in the past. So in the spectrum, so the lower panel shows the effective era, which means that in each energy, not all the photons are each energy doesn't have the same uniform sensitivity. You have different sensitivity at different energy range, and for Chandra, the highest points are at 1 kiloelectronvolts, where you have big effective era. So this telescope is big, and at the lower energy, the telescope is tiny. So it's basically the description of the era for different detectors also, because you've got the telescope and then you have detectors which detect photons, or record photons, I should say. And they have different efficiency in recording those photons. So these are our curves. They are non-linear, and our two papers on calibration uncertainties dealt with this calibration uncertainties on those curves. In image analysis, there is the exposure map, which describes the sensitivity to photons per era, and the detector is not uniform. So there are parts on the detector which are less sensitive and parts which are more sensitive to the photons. So you have to include that information in your analysis when you're trying to understand the diffuse structures in the images. And then, of course, there is the blurring, instrumental blurring effects. So in the PSF, point spread function shows you the image of the point source. So if you're looking at the point source and you observe this point source in the center of the focal plane, it will look like a point. But if this source is moved anywhere else in that space, the source is bigger and bigger. So the resolution is changing. And this effect is seen here in the image, where you have a deep image of the sky, and you see that the points in the center are very tiny, while the points outside the center are more spread. So this is the PSF effect. It's not like the source is bigger at the edge of the detector. It's basically the point spread function is big, so it's blurred. And then X-ray spectrum has similar blurring. So the energy of the photon is not recorded precisely. There is some probability that the energy is detected in the different detector channels, right? And there is some probability that the channel 400, for example, will have the energy of, record the energy of 6 kiloelectronvolts, but it can also record the energy of the 8 kiloelectronvolts. So there is this non-uniformity in detecting the energy of the photon. And in 2001, this was our first paper where we attempted to look at the statistical models for spectral analysis. And this graph shows the top shows the emitted spectrum. If this is our description of the source, looks like that. And then going through different levels of modification on the loss of the signal, we get the absorption, which modifies the shape of the spectrum. Instrument response modifies it further. There is also pileup, which reshuffles some of the photons into higher energies. And then what we observed is the bottom shape of the spectrum. So there are all these levels of the loss of the information, which we need to incorporate in the analysis. So in this highly structured statistical model, this was all included and was coded in our PyBlocks code to deal with the spectral analysis in X-rays. Okay, so I thought that we have to talk about some projects now. So I was, I pointed out to a few already. So I start with shapes and significance of structures in X-ray images. And I start with the center of our own Milky Way, the galactic center. So this is a smooth image of the central region of galaxy. And you can, when you look at this image, you see the big blobs of light. You can see the filaments up on the upper left side, and some filaments and little wiggles all around, right? So this is a smooth image, very deep image of our galactic center. But when you go to real observation, so this is the data we're looking at, real, Chandra data, which comes from 2.2 megasecond exposure, which is very long exposure of that region of the sky. And it accounted for 72 ACES observations. ACES is a Chandra detector. So looking at that image, you see the galactic center as a little green spot down there. And then there is also the readout streaks. So these are the instrumental streaks here. So this is all instrumental effects. But then there are real filaments up high, right, in this left part, which we would like to detect, perhaps. But those are, this region is very rich in the structures. We can zoom into this region. And when you zoom closer to the central region of our galaxy, you see this very sort of bright point sources, but also a lot of structures, maybe overlapping sources in the center. And it's quite difficult to decide whether there is one source or many sources there in this very, very central region, or where is our galaxy is. So this is the example of the central region, and I think I'm going to go even deeper here. So if you go even closer, and basically, in this case, we separated the observations from two different epochs of the same region. So one is July 2004, and the other one is July 2005. And when you compare these two, you can see that this bright spot in the left image disappeared in the right image. So when we merged all the observations together, we didn't see that separation. So you have to somehow get an idea that there are sources which appear and disappear, and you have to be able to look at each individual observation to understand the location of the sources, but also the variability of the sources and maybe the shapes. So the shapes may be easier, like the broader shapes may be easier to detect in the deep observations which are collected from different epochs, but the variability should come from just the individual observations in this case. This was a very strong source there. So I wanted to add that we dealt with region boundaries, and Katie has this nice talk. She had a talk in September, and then earlier, I think, describing the LIRA, which allows you to deconvolve the images and take out the PSF effect, but also then looking at LIRA outputs, she determines the boundaries of the region. So this is the top example, shows these boundaries. In the lower panel, we have different examples. So this is not the galactic center, this is just the supernova. And we have optical image and the Chandra image on the right, on the left side, where in optical you have the blobs, in Chandra we have the one sort of ring blob, and then with LIRA reconstruction we have two images in which we have a lot of little point sources, but we don't know if these point sources are real. Right now we can deconvolve and we can find this, but there is this PSF uncertainties which we didn't take into account so far to understand whether this changes and the structures which we observed coming out of LIRA are realistic, and what are the uncertainties on those structures. Then there are also images with different resolution, and this is the example of the Chandra image of one of the starburst galaxy M82. And in this image, we have a lot of marked point sources. And then there is this diffuse red structure across. And this is sort of combined image from the three different energy bands. On the right side, there is the image of the same region, but taken with NuSTAR, which is a different telescope with different point spread function and the resolution. And you can see that the same sources, when you mark them on that image, you don't resolve them, you see them as a blob. So the question is how to incorporate the knowledge which we obtain in Chandra into the image we obtain with NuSTAR, and attempt to understand the leftover sort of the energy, leftover emission when we just take out the points which we think contribute to this total emission in NuSTAR. Is there any leftover diffuse emission there? Well, actually, how to do it, we don't know right now. So I actually put the list of projects. I don't know if this was clear in these images because it's very hard to describe all of them, but I just listed them. But we're still looking into ways to characterize the shapes and detect different shapes and significance of these structures in X-ray images. LIRA allows you to deconvolve, and with the new boundaries, we can maybe find boundaries of these structures. Thomas is working on different approach and segmentation of the images, which also highlight the structures in the event files. Then taking information about the spectrum into our analysis is, we haven't done that in LIRA. So LIRA can actually you can process the images in soft and hard bands, so in different energies, and you can do ratios, or you can try to get the temperature maps of these regions or the boundaries of the spectral regions, which we haven't done so far, and that's completely open. There is crowded fields with multiple sources in a PSF region. This was the example of the galactic center, where we have these crowded regions, and we want to resolve them, resolve individual sources, handling images with different resolutions, so Chandra and XMM and NuStar, which is basically applying some of our old developed methodology to different astrophysical problems. Accounting for systematic uncertainties in image analysis, which is mainly PSF there, and identify breakpoints in this multidimensional data. So if we take into account the example of galactic center with this variability and spectrum and image, how do we look for the change? So how do we look for the boundaries of these structures? Do we find the time in which this new source appeared and disappeared? And of course, it's the efficient computations, which it would be nice to improve on the computations of, like in Lyra, for example, we have a lot of time which is spent on just the convolution of the images. So this were just few points for discussion, actually, and we can go into more details if people want, but these were my thoughts, and I don't know if this was clear to everybody what I was talking about, but if there are questions, please ask.
Thanks, Aneta. I guess the questions should be from the students.
Well, yeah.
Oh, though, of course, Shaoli, you're welcome to ask questions too.
I'm the oldest student. I'm G, whatever it is.
Well, yeah,
we're all the students.
I listed all this, when I was listing this project, I was thinking about, what we were thinking about Lyra, and because all of this relates to image analysis in some ways, and because we have Chandra, which is the highest resolution X-ray mirrors we have right now, we may have links in next decade, in 10, 15 years, but right now we are with Chandra, and there are limits to Lyra, and of course with these boundaries and the number of sources we can have, how would we apply the algorithm, which would be different probably to galactic center, to identify the point sources and the diffuse components in the galactic center, for example. Because right now it will be, it's not obvious, what do we do with that?
Yeah, and one other issue with, for example, trying to do multiple resolution observations, like using Chandra with Rosetta example, for example.
Yes.
They're taken at different epochs, and especially in the galactic center, things are going to change quite rapidly. So you got to include some sort of model misspecification error into the analysis.
Right. Also, Rosetta has a different band, right? Because it's up to 2 kV, basically.
Which overlaps Chandra. So it's
overlaps Chandra, but then doesn't have the hard part. But yeah, I mean, there's, I mean, we talked about Lyra updating the algorithm and thinking about, whole problem right now, not just, separate problems, David. Yeah.
As we're waiting for the students to give us some questions, I want to just say a few words to the students and anyone who's new to this area, or this is really a really huge area, that, from a statistical perspective, particularly for students, that working on these problems, has a huge advantage. You need you never need to justify to your faculty, say, why do you work on this problem? Okay, these are really big, important scientific problems. And the other, both kind of advantage, but depends on your view. Some of you may think these problems are challenging enough that the one thing about working this area is these data are non-human data. These data don't create problems themselves. When you're working with human data, there are all kinds of complications. People can lie, people can do all sorts of things. These are the data come with all kinds of problems, but these are kind of physical problems that we can try to understand them. And I also want to mention that this is certainly my experience having been involved with this group, is that almost anything we work on, first, there's definitely not a unique or off-the-shelf methods already ready, for you to use, because if that's the case, those probably will not be listed. It will be already done. The second is that almost anything you work on here, that you will be involved in creating some methodology or computation algorithms that itself will have applications in other areas. Just to pick up this whole question about accounting the systematic uncertainties in image analysis. I mean, that's really not unique to astrophysics or any particular field. And that's something that people had wanted for a long, long time. But as far as we know, I mean, even for the simple, very simple things like how do you even display uncertainties of a map? I mean, as things as simple as that, like how do you visualize a map and say, yeah, I got it. There's uncertainty. Like, you can't put a top map, a bottom map. It's just a mess. Right. So there.
And the correlations are even worse. It's not
right. We're not even talking about correlations, right? And so I mean, simple things as simple sounds as simple as that has that. If you can figure out like a way to even just display those things, it has great application in other areas. So I definitely want to encourage students. And okay, the one thing I want to say. Some students might be afraid, say, well, I don't know anything astrophysics. Let me give you a secret. I don't know anything about astrophysics, okay? I still don't. I mean, all my collaborators know that I don't. I would be asking really naive question. I'd be asking the same question I probably ask every year, like in the last 10 years. But somehow, I still find myself contributing a little bit. I definitely have worked in this area, creating methodologies that inspired by works here that create methodologies that are useful and are picked up by people in other areas, including in stock market. One of the things that we created here, this interweaving strategy, as some of you know, that now is being applied in this finance area, as people claim that's the only way to actually make this thing work. So I'm not getting any cut, but it's great to hear.
Too bad.
No, it's too bad. Too bad. That's the problem. Yeah. So seriously, that I think that is an incredibly rich area. So I definitely want to encourage students that to just pick up, an area of you think that you might be able to work on. And also the other thing is, don't worry about it if you find that in a month or so you find that you're not making a progress into the area. Most students working with this group knows that they've been moving around. There's various different topics. If one does not work out, you can work on different ones. And I'm quite sure that with all the experience we have, how many students do we have involved in this group? Must be dozens, if not.
Oh, I did. Well, in the past.
25.
I counted, there were 35 students.
35, yeah. And, you can talk to any of those students. Most of them, I think, that they would tell you their very rich experience. So I definitely want to encourage students to look at the list, pick up any one of the things trying to work on. And both Aneta and Vinay have been really incredible in supporting this group and bring all these problems. And there are a lot more than these. Right? This is just the one area. Vinay has the famous, what I call the Hilbert 23 problems. For those people who understand.
I will do that one sometime in February.
In February, yeah. So we have tons. I mean, in a kind of a simplistic way to summarize them, it's almost, I mean, this is probably everything else, is kind of a separate signal from noise. That, you try to see what are the patterns, what are the things that are real, what are the things are noise or can be considered as noise. And the other really important feature of almost any work in this area is always a multidimensional. right? You always have spatial temporal spectrum. I mean, just right there, there's 3, but there are others. There are others, measures, but so the problems are of the right complexity for people to working on. On the other hand, they are not like problems in genetics or others, like like with a million genes or it's, and so it's kind of a nice middle ground. Things are complex enough, but not to a point of so complex you throw your hand say, well, that's just way too much for me to get into it. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I was also thinking that this image analysis is, and the image analysis problems are maybe similar. Well, I don't know if similar, but you have the medical images where the detection of the structures are important. They're looking at some other type of maybe more predefined features than we do, but it's similar in some ways. So maybe some methods from the medical field can be applied here as well.
Absolutely.
I don't know.
They do a lot of machine learning in the medical field for image reconstruct or analysis.
Right. So that's actually a good question. I was thinking about a problem which I didn't specify here about machine learning and image X-ray images, and I just realized that with the number, this was for the jets, detecting jets, that with the number of jets that we have in X-rays, it's better for me to just go through the images than develop a method because it will be much longer. But perhaps for a student, it's not a difficult task because there is no detection algorithm which would detect structures in these images which are not predefined. So if I have a source, point source, I can detect a point source and I can detect the structure which is more sort of circular around the point source, but I cannot detect linear structures with any of the current approaches. And in Chandra source catalog, we basically miss all these jets, which they're normally jet associated with the AGN, so active galactic nuclei or star, will be very linear in the image. I didn't have it. So, but these linear structures are not handled by our detection algorithm at all. So if you look at Chandra source catalog, all the jets are missed or detected as the little knots. So you have individual sources, but not a jet in that. So that's an unsolved problem, which I could add to the list, but we have only 100 jets so far.
Actually, speaking of problems that are that seem obvious but are not solved, we still don't know how to get a good measure of whether a source is a point source or not.
Right. Or
extended, whether something is extended or a point.
Yeah. That's right. And where is the edge of this extension? We don't know. Yeah. So, the place where sort of the source merges into the background, which is very sparse, we don't know, right?
Yeah.
So, well, Katie approached some of these problems with the boundary detections, right? Well, we were working on the jet boundaries.
It's particularly interesting to hear astrophysicists say they don't know how to define a point, because for most of us, the way to see a point is you move things far away, and eventually everything become a point. But you guys just see things as farther as possible, but you still don't know how to define a point. So that's a hard problem.
Yes, because also, when you have a point source emission, you know that it comes from certain compact region, but it's also interesting to know whether this point source has some, more extended nebula around it, right? And I think that's the main interest to understand whether it's a point or is it nebular emission, because then the processes are different.
But I guess it really become a philosophical question, right? Because the point does not really exist. I mean, imagine you can travel there. It's never going to be a point.
No,
right?
because sun is not a point source for us.
Right.
The big
But
sun.
so you have to say, what do you mean by point?
Yeah. So I mean a star, or it is a star, or it is a star embedded in the big corona, which I can see, let's say, because sun has a corona.
Well, in a sense, statistically speaking, it's a question that is probably well defined, in the sense that we know what the nominal response of the telescope is to a true point source. And all we want to know is whether whatever is being observed is a departure, or how much of a departure from that point source.
Yeah, I think that we should distinguish between a point and a delta function. Because the delta function, when we put that into the telescope, we know what it looks like coming out, and we want to be able to distinguish an astronomical point source, in quotes, from what a delta function running through the telescope looks like. Because that delta function tells us what the intrinsic resolution of the system is.
Right.
That's a very interesting point. So are you saying a point can be defined as whatever, when you push through the system, it will come out just like when you're putting a delta function? It's kind of,
that's from an optics perspective, that's where I would put it. Because when we generate simulated images, like the one that Aneta showed earlier, those are actually images of delta functions as seen through the optics.
I see.
And so that gives you an idea that, at some level, a non-delta function, what we call a point source, might look different from that, or it might look the same depending upon how far away it is.
Right.
So, that's.
But that's actually a really interesting point. I actually haven't thought about this, because I've been working on trying to define things in a different content, to define things, like define what does the individual mean, right? Because here is almost like a single point. But you're saying it's interesting. You can define it mathematically. There's a clear mathematical definition. Then you say empirically, if anything, through some kind of a map, if the output is indistinguishable from a statistical perspective, define the significance levels or whatever is defined, indistinguishable from that mathematical generated object, then you can effectively define that as a kind of equivalent class of the things that called same point. Okay, that's a very very neat way of doing it. It's usually, because usually we're trying to summarize the data, go to theory, but this is really using the theory to guide what this thing is. Okay, so that would be a very interesting. Well, that's right there. It's a project for some students who want to think those kind of a really interesting fundamental questions, down to what is a point.
Yeah, so these are different images of the point through the telescope here, right?
And if any students write that you have a great thesis title called "What is your point?"
What is your point?
As long as it's not pointless.
It's even better. I love that. That's fantastic. That's fantastic. What's your point? So it's not pointless. So.
Right.
We really like to hear from some students. Young, encourage some of your students to speak. Tell them that whether they can graduate or not depends on them. So Thomas, do the same.
I think my students, they are most of them only. I think this is the first time that they see this type of high energy observations and images.
Okay.
They have been working on the solar flare related work, which is more to the sun to earth relationship on a finer scale. But I think a lot of the data processing techniques are really shared. And as soon as we get an opportunity to, probably either of us, get an opportunity to present some of the challenges, you will immediately see the shared commonalities, including image processing, including feature extraction, and including time series and stochastic process models, which we'll see that very clear.
Yeah, this would be nice to see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, feel free to ask your questions. And some background information for the students from Michigan. This group is where I get started on astrophysics related work.
Right.
Well, I do have a comment. Maybe it's a little bit related to how to define a point. Well, our data, our image data is, you actually presented one of the figures from the satellite. It's called Solar Dynamic Observatory. And, but that is, I think that is easier than your problem because your signals are actually from a very deep universe and you actually don't know where the signal's from. But when we observing the sun, we actually know where the satellite is and we have a very clear sense of what is the projected effect may have, and we can actually easily remove that effect.
Well, on the other hand, Shantog, on the sun, you have to worry about projection effects. The fact that you can actually see structure means that you have to worry about whether the structure is standing upright or it is tilted, or all those things, right? So there's always more problems to worry about.
Yes, that's true, but we don't worry about how to define the point. But we do have problems with missing data problems because sometimes that is something we cannot control, especially we want to use a time sequence. So I don't know how you're feeling about the missing data problems and what is the size of the data set that you have, like how many images you have. This data set.
Yeah, so we don't really think about images because you have this cube, it's more than cube because you have 4-dimensional information about the source you're looking at. So you've got energy and sky locations, and if you think about the information there is the timing where our observations are deep. So the shortest observation is typically, cannot be shorter than 5 kiloseconds. So you have at least 5 kilosecond observation where you account for each photon arriving during this 5 kiloseconds and each energy and each location on the sky. So you looking at the, when you think about image, you slice through this 4-dimensional space and you say, okay, these are my images in time. You can do it in time, right? And you can look at the images also in different spectral bands. So you can slice in different dimensions. And this is what we normally do right now. We basically, the analysis which we perform are on image or in spectrum or in time domain. There is now a new approach, sort of new methodology when you try to look at spectral and timing information in this X-ray images, or in our work on overlapping sources where we were looking at the spectral and variability location. So this is the eBask work, which David's student was just finalizing last month. And then you're looking at 4 dimensions altogether to get this information about, how many sources do we have? If we have 2 sources close together and one of them is variable in a different way, then maybe you can separate information between this, from these 2 sources using spectrum and using variability, which is very interesting, right? So it's kind of a different take on the data.
So it's different from like we have so when we're observing the sun, we have an exposure time for like seconds, And we assume that the sun will not change much in the exposure time. But here the observation is actually kind of like an integrated quantity. You are observing or receiving the photons all the time for actually a long time.
Right.
And of course, you can have a time-related information, time series, but the information is actually is in the integrated quantities.
Right, and it's very
actually no. That is the case with optical data. With X-rays, I mean, remember that what we have are individual photons, so we know exactly, we can slice them any way we want.
Right. That's what it is. You can slice you have 5 kilosecond observation, but you can get images which are, 100 seconds maybe, or 10 seconds. It's just, the problem now is that we have not a lot of photons because our telescope is small. This is very small telescope, so you don't collect a lot of photons from our source. It's not like sun, which has millions of photons, right, emitting. In observations, you may get 100 counts, or you may get 5 counts, or you may get 10,000 counts, depending on the source. And each count counts because it carries the information. So when I said our data is sparse, I mean, we get maybe a source with 10 counts and 5 counts in the background scattered all around. So often we accumulate 5 kiloseconds into one image when we do the observation, because the number of photons is small. It's very different. Yeah, so this is very different regime than looking at the solar data, where it's a lot of information.
Yeah, solar data, it indeed has a lot of information.
Yeah.
That's true.
A different problem then. Right?
Actually, solar data, we are not only doing images, we can actually measuring, but not very accurately, but we can actually measure in the temperature, we can actually measure in the magnetic fields, and that's kind of detailed.
Yeah, so here we're using different methods to measure temperature of the regions, because you can collect spectrum from the source, and you can look at the spectrum and measure the temperature from that source, looking at the spectrum, because you have certain emission line features which indicate the temperature at which, for example, from supernovae or from cluster of galaxies, medium comes. So you can get the temperature of the medium. Magnetic fields are a little more tricky because you have to combine the information from X-rays and radio for some of the sources, but you can sort of measure or approximate the magnetic fields which are required to emit, non-thermal emission, synchrotron emission in those sources.
Yeah.
So it's different. I mean, the physics which you physical parameters which you want to estimate are similar, because we really want to know the physical conditions at which these sources are, right, to understand what's happening there. It's just the methodology is slightly different than in the sun, for example. Yeah. But like when you're looking at these magnetic fields and reconnection events on the sun, where you generate, this CMEs and outflows. This is where, this is our laboratory. When we think about the events accelerating particles somewhere in distant galaxies, we're looking at the reconnection events. So looking at the magnetic fields and the scales, and we know what energies.
You actually observe the reconnection?
Well, we don't observe directly. We just expect that that's the mechanism or the process in which the particles which generate the radiation have to be accelerated, because the reconnection accelerates, right?
Yeah, they can generate super thermal particles.
Yeah, so that's what we expect is happening. We don't observe the reconnection itself. I mean, you can even on the sun, you sort of see the loops, but it's still not really, I mean, it's microscopic event, right? So when you think about reconnection scales, they are very different on the sun and in the extragalactic sources, like in galaxies, right? The scales will be different. Very close to black holes, you accelerate the particles to very high energies, and the reconnecting, so the characteristic scales for reconnecting events and the magnetic fields are very different.
Yeah, it depends on of course, your spatial scale and also the Alphen speed there.
Right. So the magnetic field and configurations and total energies which the energies which are emitted at the from the black holes and quasars are 10 to the 9 times the energies from the sun, roughly. So much higher, right? I mean, the sun is 10 to the 38, and we're looking at 10 to the 46, 10 to the 47 sometimes in the quasar jets. So very high energetic events.
Yeah, that is quite different.
Yeah, it's very different scales. Yes. So when when you're looking at the sun, it's very powerful, but now you have something which is very much more powerful, and it's far away and emits the radiation which we observe, and it has to be powerful, otherwise we wouldn't see it. So
that's true.
Yeah. Oh, we're almost done.
We're almost done. So any final questions, I suppose?
I will look at the time.
This. Any student who wants to ask questions, you're welcome to write to Aneta or me or Shaoli or Yang or David or anybody.
Definitely. And if you're interested in any of the problems, let us know. I mean,
yeah.
So this has been really great, and thank Aneta. Maybe we'll just take a 1 minute to talk very quickly about the plan. So Thomas, can your group do like in 2 weeks, as we were discussing, or someone else?
Wait, Kong, like Winnie, do you think Kong can talk about the work he just finished?
Yeah.
But
yeah, I mean,
I think he gave a presentation a while back.
Yeah, that was what brought Moritz into the group. So definitely, lots of things have happened since then. So it's
okay.
He has more like experimental result, and then
yeah.
He told me somehow he changes the program and then speed up the whole thing by 15 times.
Wow.
It was quite.
Right. we definitely want to hear that.
I think he did some stupid programming before, and now you look at it more carefully.
Okay, that's the way to improve it. All right. Don't tell other students. Okay.
Yeah. So yes, Kong is good.
Okay, so let's arrange that in 2 weeks, because we
let me talk to him first, making sure he's early. Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay, so that's one plan. And Anita, you have someone you want to bring in.
Yeah, but she said that she cannot do anything until April, and then I have this other Alison Strom. So I'll talk to her and see when she can.
Sure. I mean, April is fine because we have.
Yeah, Philipson will be in April 20th. I put her on the schedule. This is about time.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we just talk about bring someone from the kind of engineer side. I think the early.
Yeah, so I'll check.
That would be one. David, for your group, is David still there?
No,
David just left.
Okay. Yeah, any of your students love to want to space physics?
Yeah, space. That's what would be good to see the data and. Yeah.
Where's Xiaotong? Does he? I think Xiaotong is right there. Shantou,
so me, Zeyu, and Yu is recently working on a manuscript on a conference.
Yeah.
And this should include the data we are having is quite conclusive. So the deadline is the deadline of the manuscript is in the early March. So I think we may be able to. Well, I haven't asked two of them. I hope they don't mind. But I think we could, in principle, do this in some time in late March or in early April.
We have both March 23rd and April 6th open.
But Sheldon, thank you for doing that. But I would suggest, particularly you just said something worried me. You said your conclusion is pretty conclusive. Well, I would say that present to us before you present to the conference. I'm sure we can make the less conclusive if you want to.
Well, maybe conclusive is not